Hello, everybody, and welcome to Everybody is Terminal, a podcast about living with terminal illnesses. My name is John David. I'm going to be your host. This is the very first episode that we've done. It falls on a super special day. Today, 12 years ago, I personally got told that I was terminally ill, that I had 12 hours to live. I'm going to give you a brief overview. The podcast in general is going to be about treatment, overcoming adversity, love, loss, sex, drugs, addiction, hunting, travel, fishing, pretty much everything in life worthwhile. Nothing's off the table, and we're going to explore everything, no matter how uncomfortable for me and for you as the listener. So, with that being said, episode one, I'm just going to give you a brief overview of who I am as an individual. So, I'm going to start off by reading a psychoanalysis that I had done in August of 2011. John David is a 25-year-old right-handed engineering deep well technologist who ceased work in February 2009 after being diagnosed with non-seminoma testicular cancer with metastases to the brain. Mr. Larson underwent urgent neurosurgical resection of a cerebral mass on February 11th and was immediately started on chemotherapy. He subsequently underwent neurosurgical resection of 3 cerebral tumors in the right frontal, right temporal, and left occipital regions on March 6, 2009. All cerebral tumors were associated with extensive hemorrhage. Inoperable residual lesions were also noted on imaging in Meckel's cave, which is the base of the skull, and in the retroperitoneum, which is the meninges of the brain. John David subsequently underwent 4 cycles of chemotherapy, which ended in June 2009. He did not undergo radiation. John David's course in hospital was complicated by a secondary seizure disorder treated with anticonvulsant medication. John David underwent right auriectomy in September of 2009. John David's testicular cancer also metastasized to other parts of the body, including lung, lymph system, lungs, and spine. But other surgeries were not conducted due to John David responding well to chemotherapy and being asymptomatic. So that right there is pretty much a very clinical diagnosis of what happened. I'm going to go back a little bit to childhood. So I grew up in a relatively conservative town, I guess you could say. It was a small town in northern British Columbia. My parents were very religious people. I was a very rebellious child. In my teens, I started really getting into drugs and drug use. So pretty normal childhood, I'd say, I guess. And when I turned 17, I had decided that this little town was too little for me, and I dropped out of high school to move to the neighboring province of Alberta. I had a duffel bag full of clothes and a pair of steel-toed boots. When I left to go to Alberta, it was in a huge boom at the time, so finding a job was super easy. Pretty much anybody with 2 feet and a heartbeat could find a job in Alberta at that time. I worked there. I got a job at an engineering firm and sobered up enough to pass the piss test so that I could work there. And that brings me till early 2009. In 2009, I was originally diagnosed with choriocarcinoma, which is a very rare type of testicular cancer. That diagnosis pretty much was like a reset on my life and where I was going, what I was doing, who I was as a person, I guess. A lot of people refer to it as before cancer. and after cancer, obviously. So I was diagnosed in 2009. I had 4 brain surgeries within a couple of weeks of each other. Originally, I was given 12 hours to live, but now, I mean, we're 12 years later, so that's 12 years of borrowed time that I've already had, which I'm super grateful for. After diagnosis and going through brain surgery and um, extensive chemotherapy afterwards, I decided that I'd follow my dreams. I'd do all the things I wanted to do before I was diagnosed with cancer, because there's no time like the present, really. So in early 2010, I traveled to Europe solo. I did an extensive amount of traveling throughout Europe. I visited Germany, Switzerland, the Czech Republic, and of course Denmark, which is the old home country there. Um, so I did a lot of traveling in that time. I got back to my roots. I started really hunting and fishing a lot more. In 2014, I had a reoccurrence in my left lung of cancer. Actually, exactly 5 years after being diagnosed with cancer, I had a recurrence. The 5 year mark is significant because a lot of people who make it 5 years post cancer are then declared in remission. I went down to be told that I was in remission. It was my 5 year mark. Everything had been going well, blood tests, the cancer had all been in shape. And I was super excited. It was 5 years. I had a huge trip lined out with my girlfriend, who was just such a babe. That was in for New Year's. We were going to go to Thailand and backpack around around Asia for 3 months. So I went into this cancer appointment to get the all clear, and I definitely was not given the all clear. They did a wedge recess surgery on my left lung to pull out some of the cancer. Unfortunately, that did not go according to plan, and the cancer continued to spread. It was right around Christmas time, so they decided that I would take Christmas, or they'd take Christmas off. We'd monitor it, and in the new year we would go back with more extensive surgery if we needed to. They told me definitely don't leave the country, but I mean, Thailand, it was awaiting, and everybody's terminal. The time to do things is now. You don't know what's going to happen. I definitely didn't know what was going to happen with the cancer returning. So, on a leap of faith, we took off to Thailand, and I spent just 2 or 3 weeks there. My parents came over to spend time with us there, which was very cool. We spent Christmas and New Year's there. And then I flew back to see what was happening with the cancer. Upon returning, I was told that the cancer was still spreading. My tumor markers were growing exponentially as the days went by. I was going to need to go back into treatment as well as have more surgeries. So they went in and they did surgery and pulled out half of my left lung. This is super unpleasant. And then I started doing chemotherapy briefly after that. The chemo was exceptionally harsh, due to the fact that my body had probably built up an immunity to the chemotherapy, so they were just throwing out the strongest chemo available. After doing chemotherapy, I was sent to the bone marrow transplant unit because the cancer was still growing, so they decided to do BMT. I was a self donor, which means that they harvested my white blood cells and then they essentially just poison you as much as they can during this bone marrow treatment, and then they will re inject you with your positive white blood cells or re-inject you with blood cells to help cure you along the way. This was about a 6-month process altogether. It was terrible, probably one of the hardest things that I've did. After treatment was over, I proposed to my girlfriend at the time. Not mostly, but especially because cancer just puts everything in perspective. You really understand that there's no time but the present time, and I'm sure that is true with almost every single terminal illness. And the cancer was managed after that point. My body was clear of tumors, and I was sent along my way to continue life, which I did to the fullest. Did a bit more traveling, Vietnam, and a couple of sailing trips along the BC coast, which is just a beautiful area. In 2017, I was diagnosed with schwannomatosis, which is nerve sheath tumors, which break off the sheathing and form hardened tumors. I had over 50 tumors in my spine. They'd been following them before, but they had started to grow. One in particular in between the C7 and T1 vertebrae, so right in the base of the neck, where right around your shoulder area. This was growing, and it was starting to cause paralysis, especially in my left leg. I was told that the tumor was so big that it was pressing against my spinal column, and that is what was giving me symptoms of paralysis. We decided to go ahead with surgery on that. It carried a lot of risks. It was possible that I would become paralyzed if they hit the spinal cord, which this tumor was wrapped around. But pros and cons, decided to hope for the best and just go with what was happening. Luckily, it was a huge success. They were able to pull out this tumor, and again, I was sent home to recover from this surgery. It was in this time that I really got addicted to opiates. I was sent home with opiates for the spinal injury, and it seemed like 8 months later, I just kind of woke up out of this nodding state and realized that I was no longer in pain, and I was just living on a couch doing opiates. It's probably the most amazing drug I've ever had. It's just like you're covered in a warm blanket, and all your cares just fade away, and you just are. I remember just kind of nodding off, and people would be there, and I'd be doing opiates, and I'd just get the nods and nod off. Luckily, I was able to get off the opiates and do a recovery. After that, I traveled even more extensively. I visited more places, just lived life essentially. I did a really long, month-long trip, a sailing trip up and down the BC coast. And that pretty much brings us to the end of the dumpster fire that was 2020 and the beginning of 2021. I'm obviously going to jump super in depth on some of these subjects in my upcoming episodes. Super stoked that you're following along here. You can subscribe to my YouTube or check me out on Facebook. I'd love to get messages if you have a story about living with a terminal illness or overcoming a terminal illness. I'd love to hear about it. You can get a hold of me via email, and yeah, episode 2, we're probably going to jump into a bit of traveling stuff. So, my first travel, when I traveled Europe solo after treatment, we're going to get into that and some of the degenerative things that happen on that. So, yeah, thank you again for coming along and listening.